Here is Sailor Manyo Chigaya, a black ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
A beautiful dark black, giving solid, crisp lines on the page. There is no tone variation from one paper to the other, and it doesn't shade, which is how I prefer my black inks to perform. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it is a solid performer, no degrading in quality, not in the least. The trouble here becomes the plethora of black inks that are beautiful and solid performing, and that's where I think it would lose out when it comes time to buy a bottle.
The pen for today is
a Pilot Custom 912.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
On the Clairfontaine, we get a beautiful dark black with no color variation whatsoever. I mean, it's solid, but it's not the darkest black that I've ever used, not by far. So if that's the thing that matters to you, I'm not sure that this is really the one. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade, just looks good and doesn't draw any attention away from the important things you're writing to say, hey, look at this ink. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we see no bleeding and no ghosting.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Sailor Studio 027.
Here is Sailor Studio 130.
Here is Sailor Studio 140. Here is Sailor Studio 150. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Check out how this is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. How it does not feather, how it does not spread, how it does not shade, how it looks so good this whole way through. I think it makes my penmanship look better. On the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, there's no bleeding, no ghosting, so we can thankfully always write on the back of the page with this ink.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
I was really expecting that this might have an effect on the ink only because of what this paper tends to do, but it didn't. It gave the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It didn't feather, it didn't spread, it didn't shade. It gave a solid performance the whole way through. It's the problem when an ink does this well, there's not so much to say. Looking at the back of the page between those wiggling fingers, we see that it does get a little deep into the paper at a couple of times. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath. Now, as far as these deeper spots that I'm pointing at, whether these would be a problem for you, I don't know. The ghosting is really almost non-existent, so fantastic.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
It is the quad rule that has us looking at the Rhodia paper, and it stands out with no problems. And not that it's any kind of a real surprise there. Now, it is the same tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade, does look absolutely beautiful. Looking at the back of the page between those wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company Edgar T. Steel Works Coal Black. Here is Califolio Noir. Here is Caran d'Ache Cosmic Black.
Here is Colorverse Black Hole.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The great thing about the lab notebook is it often lightens and dulls an ink a little bit. Kind of shows a little bit of what it has as I'm going to call a weakness. Now it is a slight bit lighter as a black, but it didn't dull it at all. I didn't get any kind of feathering and I didn't get any kind of spread. I still didn't get any kind of shading. It still stands out against this quad rule really well. It still is a very enjoyable ink to use with some great performance. Looking at the back of the page, right here between those wiggling fingers, it doesn't bleed, doesn't ghost, and will make every student happy that they can write back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is KWZ Maroon number 2. Here is Waterman Radiant Pink. Here is Diamine Amber. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Fred Rogers Cardigan Red.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
The copy paper usually shows some of the worst qualities an ink can have. This does have a little bit of feathering that's going on and fairly consistent in its feathering, and it does spread. Now I find the feathering here just to be a bit distracting. Probably more to do with the pen that I was using and a drier, finer pen. I suspect this would have done much better here than it did. So while it feathers and while it spreads, I'm not going to hold it against it because of that pen. I think this is fairly good, and I don't know if I just have a good batch of copy paper or I'm just becoming much more tolerant of it. Looking at the back of the page, between those wiggling fingers, we see the ink gets incredibly deep into the page. The whole way, if you held it to a mirror, you might be able to read what's going on. A lot of ghosting is what I'm trying to say, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
I suspect that a medium to dry writing pen will show that this looks kind of like a dark gray or a faded black. So no need for that kind of disappointment, but you've been warned. To keep this great dark tone, I go for a wet writing fine or medium pen. The music nib on Tomoe River paper, which is how I'm taking my notes, is showing some of the weakness of this ink, and no one really wants to experience it, but I am seeing quite a bit more of the gray coming through. I don't use Tomoe River paper in the reviews. I have a few notebooks of it, but it's not available anymore. So why do it in reviews?
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.